Welcome to Let's Talk Democracy. I'm Tina Johnson, your host. Join me as we talk to the people on the front lines, the change makers and activists who are building a stronger, healthier democracy for all of us. Whether you're looking for expert advice, a new perspective, or just a little inspiration, this is where you'll find it. Welcome back to Let's Talk Democracy. I'm Tina Johnson, your host. Social media was once hailed as a force of connection. Today, it often divides us, amplifying outrage and eroding public trust. But what if the problem isn't human nature? What if it's design? I'm joined by Paul Bonifacio, a French tech professional turned social entrepreneur who believes we can rebuild digital spaces to support dialogue, not division. Together, we explore how platform choices shape behavior, reward extremes, and influence the health of our democracies. And we ask the big question, what would social media look like if it prioritized reflection, accountability, and meaningful human connection? Today's episode, Deliberation by Design, Rebuilding Social Media for Democracy, invites you to rethink the digital spaces you inhabit every day and imagine how they could be transformed from engines of division into foundations for democratic renewal. Let's get into it. Hey, Paul, thank you for joining me today. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Hi, Tina. Thanks for having me.
I had a really interesting conversation with Professor Lisa Shurich on the role of social media and technology on democracy. You and I have talked before about a project that you're working on, and so I was like, oh, Paul would be great to follow up on this from a social entrepreneur activist perspective. You're in the startup phase of a project where you're building an alternative social media platform using mediation and dialogue where human connection is fostered instead of the current echo chambers that we are all familiar with. Wanted to open this conversation with you by asking a question. What was the moment when you realized our public conversations are broken?
Right. Well, I'm not sure there was one aha moment, but it's very much been kind of a gradual experience. If I can say just a few words about my personal experience, I've worked in tech in the last 10 years. I happen to be French, but most of that I've worked outside of France. And I got unlucky enough to have kind of a chain of events, which is pretty peculiar. I started working in the UK back in 2015 and 2016, right at the moment of the campaign for Brexit, which is, as a lot of experts mentions, one of the first events of the questions around polarization on social media. And then I moved to Brazil, and I actually was there at the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, social president at the time, up to the point of Bolsonaro's presidency. And then I moved to the US under Trump's first administration, which was also extremely polarizing with obviously a context around COVID, but also Black Lives Matter that was very active at that time. And eventually I moved back to France, which happens to have its own democratic questions around the Yellow Vest movement back in the 2016, 2017, 2018 years, but also more recently the dissolution of our parliament and the political problems that have occurred out of it. And what's interesting in that in those four countries that I lived in, I saw and I witnessed a clear dissonance between a tech ecosystem, startups that happen to really thrive both financially and in terms of status and success. And on the other end, our democracies that are very much being threatened and that are suffering more and more from a public discourse which is degraded and a polarization that keeps going up. And so I guess that's the dissonance between the two that really drove me to leave my job last year and focus on that topic full time.
Before you started this project, how did you personally engage in political or civic conversations?
Yeah, I didn't that much, actually. I've always been a mediator at heart in terms of personality and I guess of personal preference. But I wasn't a political person that much. I worked for a long time for a public agency that works on helping French businesses to expand in the US and Canada. So there's a bit of public service behind it, the importance of helping your own, I would say. And more recently, in the last 5 years, I was working in a sustainability company here in France, which actually happens to have a global remit. So I was very much focused on other topics around the economic progress of France and the sustainability problem around climate change in general. But politically and in terms of activism, I didn't consider myself an activist. I don't think I was one. I just happened to have seen something that was really, really problematic to me. I think we were both part of a public dialogue back in Norway in December. And someone in the assembly said something that I really related it, which what's the definition of an activist, right? And they said something like along the lines of an activist is someone who understood the roots of a big society problem so much so that they cannot stay idle and not act on it anymore. I guess that's really what's been happening for me. But I didn't consider myself an activist beforehand.
If you weren't an activist before, if you weren't really thinking about these things, what was the moment where you felt like, okay, I need to engage in this kind of dialogue process or space? Because the project you're working on specifically is around creating what is normally called a deliberative platform or deliberative space where folks can actually communicate with one another in not so hostile or crude or rude or unkind ways.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
and so that's what you're focusing on now. And how did you come to this? So you've been to England, you were in Brazil, you were in the US, where this trifecta of political, social move was happening. And suddenly you get to this place where you're like, okay, something has to change.
Yeah. So I guess that's the moment that I kind of linked all of my different experiences with one of the problem of our democracies today, which is social media. I was born in '91, so I'm part of that generation that really grew up with social media. I'm part of the people that started with MSN, but obviously afterwards understood that Facebook was cooler and more recently than Instagram was cooler, and actually didn't fall into TikTok just yet. But I've seen several generations of those first social media platforms, right? And I guess at the beginning, when we discovered those platforms, there was this very strong and very appealing myth of a global village, a place where you could actually connect with everybody. There was a romance of it, of the authenticity that you could put online, but also the serendipity you would get out of connecting with anyone everywhere. And I was really appealed by that. And what's interesting also is that those social media platforms at the time, especially in the 2010s, were really seen as democracy's right arm. Like one of the best things that can happen for democracy, something that really helped boost and actually probably trigger the Arab Spring movement in a lot of countries. Some platforms that back in the time we thought would really help topple an autocratic government in China and hopefully bring democracy to other countries apart from the ones that are already democracies. So there was a lot of good intentions out of it. And my personal belief is that people that worked in those platforms happened to be good people, most of them. And there was a lot of optimism out of it. And this optimism is linked to the optimism of the tech ecosystem in general and the startups world that I happen to have worked with and in the last 10 years. It was really this idea of there's an alignment of interest between adventurous, innovative, and courageous entrepreneurs that just move fast and break things. And they get very rich doing so. But they also happen to build stuff that is actually good for society. That was a very strong narrative back in the 2010s. And this is something that I believed in myself. But all those democratic crises I happened to witness were really a triggering moment for me to understand that no, actually something's going very wrong. Something very wrong because this romance of authenticity that was promised with all social media platforms happens to be very much more of an attention economy that is more and more generated or at least driven by AI and by algorithms and by personal interests that are not that much of this global village that I hoped. Another thing that really struck me is the fact that actually this is not a public square, a digital agora where everybody has their word to say. It's the difference between freedom of speech and freedom of reach, right? Actually, The number that really struck me is that 73% of political posts and political driven posts are actually created by only 6% of Twitter users, as far as Twitter is concerned, or X now, as we call it. That really shows an idea, a narrative of a decentralized place where everybody has a voice, but actually there's still some very, very strong centralizing forces that are not as friendly and as democracy friendly as I had hoped. So I guess that was part of the problem for me. And obviously that led to the problem of polarization and effective polarization, which is extremely problematic as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting just what you said about the 6% of Twitter users are the ones that are driving 73% of the political post,
Mhm.
and how that creates. I mean, I'm not on Twitter, but for good reason. I have other things to do with my time than to tweet at or be tweeted at by people. But that for those people that are on Twitter and they see these posts and they're engaging with them, whether they're scrolling or sharing, that they're disseminating a lot of the same people's information without creating broader or greater space for more diverse perspectives or ideas. And this calls into question the impact on what is actually public debate, and whether public debate on social media can be considered public debate when you have so few people who are actually contributing to the conversation. And so when you think about just the number that you just shared and sort of your process of how you've gotten to where you are around thinking about how to create digital public space where there could be more interaction, what worries you the most about there not being alternatives to the existing social media, digital communities that currently are where people get their information or are being engaged around political issues that undermine or frame democratic values and principles?
I'm not sure I can find one thing that worries me the most, but there's a bunch of things that are really worrying me, that are really driving my work at the moment. One of them is what you just said. It really isn't the place where we can have a deliberative dynamic and an actual dialogue between people on whatever topic we want to discuss about. One of the reasons is this centralization of influences that has been really increased in the last few years, that really actually creates a dynamic in which the silent majority listens to an extremely polarized and polarizing minority. And that's part of the problem. Another problem that you touched on real quick is the bubble effect, that we obviously tend to see more and more of the content that we actually already agree on and we like, which is a problem around the business model. And those are things that I'm very concerned about. Maybe one thing I'm more concerned about, on top of anything else, is another myth. This myth that these platforms are neutral and that there's no any other way, I guess. A lot of people say today that social media is polarizing, as if there wasn't any place for a non-polarizing social media, as if the problem was with us as human beings, that we're polarizing animals by default, that's just connecting us, that is going to create naturally this polarization. This is something that I don't believe in at all. And there's been a bunch of experiences that show that. Just the fact that the human race has created villages, cities, kingdoms, and empires before internet existed really shows that we as a social species have been able to talk to each other, coordinate with each other, and decide to build some stuff together. I'm not saying that there's never been conflict in the history of mankind. There's been a bunch. But we've been able to do stuff and to not fall into this extreme polarization that we see on social media today. One interesting experience that may illustrate my point on that is that some scientists, I think it was in the US back in 2019, created a version of Twitter that was empty. And they only populated that kind of modeled environment with some AIs that were neutral. And just to see how these would interact with each other and how the platform would regulate that. And what they realized is that after a few months, this platform became extremely polarized as well. So there's a design problem here, which is completely separate from the human mind. There's a design that enhances polarization and that creates part of the problem we have today. And I think that design has to do with a business model again. And that doesn't mean that there isn't any polarization with humans. Obviously, we have also some cognitive biases that create that polarization. There's the homophily, that we tend to want to find people that are in our circle of similarity. That's a very strong effect. There's the confirmation bias, which is a very strong and very well documented thing. And there's the backfire effect also. When you try to convince someone and you confront them with an opposite opinion, they tend to entrench even more. So those are things that are really in our brain that are very true. But by themselves, they shouldn't be enough to create that much polarization. They've been enhanced by the algorithms and by the design choices of those platforms. And that's, in my opinion, is a choice by those platforms and is not necessarily the fact of any social media platform that can exist in the future.
Yeah, it's when Lisa and I spoke on this topic in the last episode, she brought up what you brought up, algorithms, the fact that it's a deliberate business model that they've created.
Yeah.
Polarization drives people to consume. They consume information that supports polarization because it's like a car wreck. She used this example, and I agree. It's like, there's a car accident, and everyone slows down to check it out, slowing down
Yes.
all of the traffic behind them.
Right.
And so we're engaged in carnage or wreckage. Somehow we're so engulfed by it. And that the role that social media platforms now currently use is, how do we keep people on our platforms longer? And they've decided or found out that by presenting the most extreme views, the most caustic rhetoric and vitriol on their platforms holds people's attention. And so it does get to this conversation, and I appreciate your point about how there is polarization, but we're not polarized to the extent in our own everyday interactions with each other where we can't have a conversation. But on social media, we're so polarized, which then translates into there's a line or a border that can't be crossed that doesn't naturally exist for human beings because we've always had to find a way to work together to solve problems. And now with social media, there's this barrier that allows us to not try to find a way to meet each other, to either resolve the conflict or to have an agreement to agree to disagree. And it just begs the question, how does social media and technology evolve into a space where its role is to depolarize and to create more of this public dialogue environment that allows for more honest interactions, human interactions, than the artificial ones that you just used as an example when with the AI being left to its own devices, finding a way to be polarized.
Right. Yeah. Which is now that I'm thinking about it, it's kind of a foreshadowing of what's happening with a Globot social media platform. I don't know if you've heard about that. Created a social media platform that is only accessible to AIs. And so that it looks like a Reddit type of microblogging platform where human beings are able to look and see and hear what's been said, but they can't interact. And I don't know how much is staged, but obviously it's a great PR stunt. And a lot of people are actually looking at AIs talking to each other about what they think about humans and how they should resolve that technical issue or stuff like that. Then I forgot your question. Sorry.
Yeah, the
Um,
question is, how does social media move forward
yeah.
from its existing position on how I mean, the bottom line is that it's about money, right? Like the social media
Yeah.
platforms are about making money, and making money means holding people on your platforms. And if that is the market, if that's what the market demands, I don't sure that's what it demands, but and that's what you're going to supply, where is the space for a deliberative platform to exist or a dialogue friendly depolarization platform to exist within the social media space?
Yeah, the way I see it is very much like junk food. I don't know if you've already heard about this comparison.
Yes, Lisa actually talked about this in the episode,
Okay,
but
so
yeah.
I won't repeat it again so that you don't have
No,
twice the same thing.
no, go ahead.
But
I think it's a great metaphor. Yeah.
right, so very quick then, current social media platform are kind of the junk foods that emerged in the 90s, 2000s before we understood the risks for health that would be linked to that type of fast food type of solutions. And it seemed great. It was extremely convenient. It was fast. It looked cool. And a lot of people just wanted to use that. And then the more we understand the impact, the more time passes and the more people are kind of reacting to it and hopefully trying to eat a bit more healthy. And what we see is more and more organic and healthier food being sent, being sold in restaurants and in supermarkets. And that's typically, I believe, that's going to happen with social media as well, is that people are going to understand that there's something worse and worse with current social media platforms. My fear is still that they don't see enough of how bad it is, but I still believe very strongly that they're understanding more and more why it's a problem. One of the reasons on that, if I can do a quick detour, is the concept of entitification. I don't know if you heard that word before. So the entitification it's a very popular word in France, which is funny because it's more of an English word which is mixed with I don't know where it comes from actually, but it's the concept for which you're going to create a very lean and very well designed platform. And when you have a lot of people on it and that they're really hooked to your platform, then you're going to keep adding new features to make it more clunky, more complex, and most of the time less user friendly and less cool, but easier for you to monetize as a company. So you're going to get more money out of it and it's going to be less nice and less convenient for your users. And that's very much what's been happening with social media on top of the polarization that we've mentioned. Facebook, that I really grew up with, has become way more cluttered than it used to be and way less easy to navigate with. And that's clear. Like people really see that. And social media platforms tend to copy each other. Instagram used to be only picture focused. Now there's Reels. Meta has launched Threads. WhatsApp has put an AI toggle that nobody asked for. And so all those different features are features that are not coming out of user need and people asking for it. It's coming out of a business models centered thinking of how can we make money out of a population that is now hostage, that is hooked to our platforms, and we know it's not easy to get out of. The problem with that is that they're probably pushing a bit too much. And so there's more and more people that are going to want to do something else and to find alternatives. So I think that's one of the main sources of hope for me for the emergence of new platforms is that people are starting to understand more and more that it's not in their best interest to go to McDonald's every day. And I guess that's going to help bring some space. But back to your question, I guess the first thing that's going to create a space for a more democracy friendly platform is going to be the business model. From the moment you have a business model based on ads, those ads create a high incentive for you to hook people on your platform for more time and for you to have more and more personalized content so that you can optimize that ad revenue of yours, which happens to be your business. So it's really fair game for you to try and optimize that. So if you want to create a social media platform that has at heart this question of people connecting and having hopefully positive dialogues, you have to find another business model, another way to make money, unless you have something that is completely backed by a foundation just like Blue Sky, which is great. But I really think this is an anomaly and this is not going to be the main solution for most social media platforms. And so there's really not that many other options to monetize a social media platform. The obvious solution is a paywall. And that's my personal bet, is that more and more people will start to agree to pay a very small amount of money in order to have a platform in which they feel safe, they feel they can connect to human beings, and they feel they're not being exploited by a very opaque company that happens to be HQ'd overseas and that happens to have more and more polarizing opinions. I did a bit of math on that, and it's interesting to see that companies like Facebook or X typically make €1 to €3 per user per month out of ad revenue. And so asking people to pay €1 per month to have access to a platform that is well designed, that has put their needs and their well-being at center, and that happens to help them connect with people in the way they want, that doesn't sound so far-fetched at all.
I find it interesting when we talk about moving from I'm going to call it open source, using that term very broadly, but
Yeah,
like an open source platform, meaning that people have access to it just by downloading without having to, these are air quotes, pay for it. So Facebook, in theory, is free, but it's not. You have access to it. But for folks
yeah,
to have to pay for a trusted social media space seems to be counterintuitive to social media. It seems to be counterproductive to what social media spaces are supposed to be. And it also makes me think about people who can't afford the €1 a month.
yeah.
Then it means that there are certain people who have access to secure spaces for information, and other people, a lot of people, who don't have access to secure spaces for information. Because all things being as they are, not everyone has the same economic ability
Of
to
course.
pay for the things that would benefit them. And in the context of what that means for being able to engage in a democratic society, it seems that spaces that help disseminate information should be free. You want to create a platform where you can have deliberative dialogue.
Right.
Why do you want to create the space?
I want to create that space because I believe that the by default option for people to interact online is a bunch of platforms that are owned by foreign actors that don't have democracy at heart and that don't have even European principles and European interests at heart. I'm talking from a European perspective because I happen to be French, but I also think it relates to a lot of countries. And so I want to create this because I truly believe in the fact that if we want our democracies to prevail and if we want our human links to be preserved, we'll have to find another place for us to connect with each other online than the ones that exist today. I don't believe in techno solutionism, and I don't think that the perfect platform will resolve the problem of polarization worldwide. But I do believe that whatever we decide, even if we decide to go in a degrowth, more sustainable society in the future, which is an option, we will still interact online in some way at some point. And we do need a way to interact online in a more independent, autonomous and sovereign, but also less polarizing way. So that's my true belief, is that we'll need something else at some point, and the sooner the better. That's the main reason.
How does the platform that you're envisioning, how does it function to create that? I'm not going to call it a utopia, but create the type of interaction that you feel is missing currently.
Yeah, I haven't built it yet. So I have assumptions and not that many certainties. There's a few things that come to mind. The way social media platforms are built today mix a lot of different things, from hearing from your friends to talking about political topics and following political influencers to getting your news. And this is very much an everything platform type of philosophy that gets back to that entitification thing I mentioned earlier. They're trying to capture more and more of your time and your attention with other use cases that you might be interested in. I don't want to do that. I do believe that we need a place for talking that is solely for talking. And so back to the point you mentioned earlier, I don't believe that whatever I'm going to build is going to be used for people to hear about what's happening in the world and to get their news. I think that's a different work. That's a different job. That's a journalist's job. And that's not something on which I have either expertise or will to go into. So the main thing is build a place that is for dialogue and human connection before anything else. What's interesting is that when you look at the social media usage today, that's very much what people are more interested in. A research that was done in about a dozen countries in the OECD last year, mentioned that 50% of the people have put keeping in touch with friends and family as the first use case of social media. And the second reason, which is a bit depressing, 40%, is filling spare time. And so I do not believe I want to do both of those things. I want to only do one and do that well, which is keeping in touch with friends and family and connecting with people you actually care about. And hopefully having a serendipity engine so that you can reach out new people that you might connect with. But it's still about connection and connection first. And that's one of the interesting learnings I got from the trainings we did together at the Nansen Center, right? Because I come from France and we have this very Cartesian rational philosophy around dialogue. We talk way more about debate than dialogue, actually, which is this narrative of we are educated citizens, we're going to be confronted with facts, arguments, we're going to have a debate about it, and at the end, the best idea will prevail, right? That's the perfect theory of a democracy. I still believe that this has value, obviously. I have realized that 90% of the time, that's not what's happening, either on social media or in real life, because we're social animals and we happen to talk with complicated and sophisticated words on complicated and sophisticated ideas, but we actually talk most of the time from the bottom of our hearts. And what moves us is emotion and connection. And so realizing that is understanding that it has to be about dialogue first before being about facts, arguments, and actual debates. So that's one very strong principle that I have in mind. A thing that comes to mind is friction. Current social media platforms and a lot of the tech ecosystem has been built with the premise of user friendliness and having the experience as smooth as possible. It should be extremely easy. You should just go on your couch and you can turn off your brain and you just know how to doom scroll, right? You have nothing to do. And it basically is a very passive state on which the app does everything for you. So that is the most convenient and the less friction as possible. There's a limit to this. And I do believe that a bit of friction is good. I happen to like coffee, for example. I do grind my coffee by hand every morning. That sounds a bit ridiculous, but it became a ritual of mine. And I'm sure you have other rituals that you do that are not the most productive, the most efficient ways of drinking your tea, preparing your food, going for a walk, whatever it is. And this friction is part of human life. And this friction also happens in social interactions. And so having a platform that takes that into account and is not always looking for the shorter path, but does cultivate the longer path is the way to go. An inspiration I have out of this is Reddit. Reddit does a bit of that. Reddit which is more of a blogging type of platform in the old sense of blogging, meaning people actually write a lot on that. And it's very much less on emotion, even though there's still polarization on Reddit, obviously. There is friction with using Reddit. It's not as easy to understand where the information is and where you're looking at a topic, which is which bike should I buy? You would go on a subreddit, which is specialized on bikes, and then you would see the comments and the recommendations from dozens of people. And you would go through all of that and you would take a lot of time doing this. And that's friction. The non-friction way would be to ask ChatGPT which bike you should buy. The ironic dimension of it, obviously, is that ChatGPT happens to be fed with a lot of data coming from Reddit nowadays. So there's kind of a loop out of this. But still, my point is there has to be a certain amount of friction so that you can actually slow down and that when you do create a meaningful connection, you actually really enjoy it. And that creates something, in my opinion, which is stronger than the very weak but very easy dopamine shot you get each time you doom scroll on Instagram or TikTok. Another thing that I think is very interesting is the question around anonymity or pseudo-anonymity, right? Social media platforms today have decided to be anonymous. You can decide to put your real name on it, obviously, and to have a verified account, just like X does. But most users actually have put another pseudo or have put their name, but they're never actually identified as a human being. I think there's value in having a certain amount of accountability attached to you. And this accountability can be done in different ways because there's a problem with having accountability as well, especially if you go in countries with autocratic values or if you're part of a minority that happens to be threatened. There's obviously a big problem around this. But I am exploring at the moment a layered accountability and anonymity feature on which, in order for you to go on the platform I would build, you would need to prove that you are a human being, first of all, and to verify your identity. That identity would be stored in a confidential, hopefully very secure way on the platform and would not be displayed to everybody. But then, depending on the discussion and the circle you want to go in, you could go on a place where you can reveal yourself, or you can go on a more anonymous place. But if your behavior on that more anonymous place still does not align with the ground rules of that space, there is a clear way for you to be accountable about that because the platform knows who you are. And so there's here a clearer incentive to take responsibility for your actions, which is kind of one of the problems of current social media platforms. The interesting thing about taking responsibility is that doesn't mean you don't have a right to be wrong or you don't have a right to make mistakes. And another problem of current social media platform is there's no right to forget. At the peak of cancel culture in the late 2010s, some very big celebrities would be pointed out because they did a tweet or a Facebook post 10 years earlier on something that was really not okay. And they were really going after those people. I think it was a great way to call out some behaviors that were not respectful, that were really bad, or to sometimes take the mask off some really bad people, for sure. But it also is a very dangerous mechanism in which if you tell everybody that whatever they say at whatever moment can be recorded for all time and that we can call back that moment whenever we want, that's too heavy of a toll for you to have an interesting and meaningful dialogue. Because for you to be able to have a place for self-development, for you to be able to create your opinion, to educate yourself, you do that most of the time by talking to people. And most of the time by starting to talk to people, you're wrong. And that's okay. And it should be okay to be wrong up to certain points. And so the right to forget, with details that I'm not sure about how it should work, seems important to me because it's important to leave space for someone to change their mind and to mature and to grow. And if you never forget what they say, you never leave that space.
Lisa and I, we talked about turning off the comment section on posts or other ways in which platforms could color code or somehow use identifiers so that you understood if someone was talking about family or politics, or just not having the comments on, which meant that people couldn't respond. They just had to listen to what the other person said, in a sense, like take it in, and then they could respond by writing something of their own and no one could respond back. Taking out this need to always come back, not with a question of curiosity or a question for understanding, but wanting to prove the other person's wrong, to debate, to be in conflict. Taking that out would avoid those things. So I think that this idea that you can create a platform where you can have, and I'm using the term deliberative dialogue because that's the term that is being used, that it's an intentional space that's created in which you can have conversations with one another that are meant to engage each other in listening and understanding and not simply reacting. And so I'm kind of in this space where I think, yes, we need that because social media is here and it's here to stay. But I'm also in this space of we do much better when we have direct interaction with one another, the face-to-face interactions that allow us to read body language, to take a breath, to see the other person, their facial expressions, to be able to see each other and look at each other in the eye. And so there is this tension, I think, of how do you really create a space where people can engage through any platform, where they can have conversations that build trust, that build a space for understanding, and build compassion and empathy, because I think social media allows that anonymity that you talked about, allows for people to ignore these basic human tendencies that are required for us to be able to live in a cohesive manner in society as a whole. And if you create a platform that creates these spaces for this type of interaction, how does it not go to the space where I'm assuming you're going to need to pay your bills. So if you're not, are you going to have ads? Like, how do you ensure that the space does not evolve as Facebook has or X, that it doesn't evolve or devolve into a cesspool of people at each other's throats because you need to pay the bills?
That's an ethical question I haven't answered yet. There's a few things that come to mind. The first thing is, as far as paying bills is concerned, I'm way more interested in a paywall and a paid subscription than ads, specifically so that if I want to get more revenue, I just have to make sure people that are using my platform are more happy or that I'm getting more of them instead of trying to make them more and more miserable. But I do recognize the problem with this and the fact that this creates a bias of inclusivity that you've mentioned earlier. What about the people who cannot afford that amount, however small, I mentioned? How do I handle that? And I don't have a clear answer for this. But in terms of business model and how to pay the bills, I don't see any other way. On the rest, having this idea of cutting comments or having a color code depending on the topic you're mentioning, I'm not sure that's the route I want to go into. I'm not a big fan of preventing people from doing something or from saying something. I think the moment you touch on this question of censorship, that sounds extremely harsh, and that even sounds like you're looking down on your users and telling them how you want them to behave without leaving them any place for freedom. I'm way more interested in nudges, in the design choices of the platforms that will encourage a certain types of behavior rather than another one. It will not prevent the toxic and more negative type of behavior. It would just be less incentivized the way it is today. A good way of doing that is the algorithm that shows you your feed on TikTok, X, or whatever. This algorithm, as we mentioned earlier, is based on whatever is the most engaging, what's the most polarizing, what's the most emotionally loaded. How about the way we show content to people and the people that tend to have a more visibility or the most success, however we decide that means in that platform? However, that was decided by another criteria, which would be how constructive this person is, how empathetic they have been, how able they've been to listen to other narratives and to hear the other person's experience or arguments. Then you create a space where the people who are less constructive and more toxic are still there. They can still talk. They just happen to not be what you see the most. And I do believe way more in that type of design choice rather than forcing people to all have the right behavior, which in my personal opinion doesn't work.
Yeah, I think the idea of the right behavior, I think conflict is natural. We are human beings and we're
Mm-hmm.
never all in alignment with each other's way of
Yeah.
thinking, our perspectives. We have different lived experiences. That type of tension, contentiousness, conflict. I don't think there's anything wrong with not having a platform that's conflict averse. You should have a space for that. And the idea, though, that people can be more than that, the extremism there, that creates a question of is what would be considered good social media behavior. And I think, as you said, it's
Yeah.
maybe an ethical question. And I
Yeah.
do think that that is something that has to be considered as it is in what is ethical speech in just a normal space. You have, hate speech is a crime or saying things against a group of people based on something. There are rules within society that says, yes, you have freedom of speech. Yes, you can say what you think. And yet there's responsibility in that. So when the views become so extreme that they become hurtful to other groups of people, hurtful to the way a democracy functions, that becomes a very different conversation. And I think that that is where a lot of social media platforms struggle. because it is freedom of speech. But then it's like, so to what
Yeah.
extent does
Yeah,
that
for sure.
speech become free for you but detrimental to another? And I don't think that we have to answer that on this episode of this podcast, but I do think it's
Yeah.
part of the, it's part of that ongoing evolution of how social media platforms and then the expectation of the way in which we've organized society and how what we said we expect from one another in the real world versus what we say we expect or I give permission to people on social media to do. And there's a conflict, right? There's a conflict there because people do things on social media they would never do in real life. They say
For
things they
sure.
would never say in real life. And so,
Yeah.
so I just think that that's part of it. So I don't believe in policing people. I think people should be able to speak. But I do think that at the core of the conflict of social media is that there seems to be less responsibility taken by people in the way in which they choose to engage. And that, in essence, has created this big void, especially within democratic spaces, where the undermining of a structure and how we share information, the kind of information that we're sharing. So much misinformation that is allowed to permeate social media platforms. And then the kind of speech that's also out there and allowed to permeate social media platforms contributes to bad dialogue. So we're
Yes.
moving away from the dialogue that provide building blocks towards each other for understanding. And then it also creates bias. Ways. How do you avoid the bias of creating space where everyone it's a free for all? Yes, everyone say what they
Yeah.
think, and yes, we'll have some algorithm that says you're being too extreme, or the reverse of that, right? Like, I think that that's the argument. It's like, if we don't allow people to speak, we're being biased to one way of thinking. If we say that people who are speaking too extreme, then we're biased towards this. I mean, there seems like in some way that there is a bit of a bias, and the bias stems from what contributes to healthy dialogue or good dialogue and allows for there to be space for people to engage in intentional dialogue that allows for there to be movement towards understanding and sustaining the social framework of how we are supposed to interact with one another as citizens.
For sure. I completely agree with you, but there's always going to be bias. And the biggest danger is to think there's such a thing as a neutral social platform, whether it's the old ones, as I've mentioned, that are nothing neutral, or whatever I might or someone else might build. This is never going to be neutral. I have my own cultural background. I'm half French, half Brazilian. That's going to influence the way I'm going to build things. And this is going to potentially influence then the way people would interact on whatever I'm going to build. So I really believe that a couple of things that come to mind on how to tackle this, mitigate it at least, is one is that's why we've met. The reason we've met is because I understood that before trying to build anything on the technology sector, I needed to understand what a good dialogue looks like. And so I've been doing several trainings of several types of conflict mediation, debate organization, or dialogue facilitation in order to speak and listen from people who have asked this question way before social media existed. In order for us then to understand that in that not ideal, because then again, there's not only one definition, but in that relatively good dialogue that we understand, which have those criteria, those specificities, which of those can we realistically put into the digital realm, and how can we use those in order to have as positive as we can of a conversation between human beings online. So that's the one thing that is at the center of my journey, is to start by trying to study this and understanding as much as I can before I actually build anything technological. That has to come second, after understanding how to address this ethical dilemma, which is going to remain a dilemma, but at least understand it better. That's the first thing. The second thing is, well, maybe there shouldn't be one social media platform with 7 billion users on it, right? Like, that's the case for WhatsApp, Facebook, and X and TikTok to a smaller matter. I think they have 2 to 3 billion users. I can't remember the number, whatever it is. Social media is by definition social. So it is grounded in culture and in geography and in people. So it doesn't make sense that a digital place is governed and designed by a very specific type of people for the rest of the world. I do believe there's a big ethical problem with this, apart from any questions around business model and the polarization. Just the fact that a bunch of white dudes from the Silicon Valley designed how we interact online, the rest of humanity, that there's something wrong with this. So what I believe is one of the solutions is an archipelization of social media platforms. So there's not going to be one option alternative, which is the one built by Paul. There actually is probably going to be tens or hundreds of platforms that are more local and more sovereign also to whatever this continent, this country, this culture believes is the right way to interact. Because that is grounded into social relationships and how human interacts. And there's no way this shouldn't be something that is discussed at the local level. And there's a humility factor to this. Someone who believes they can design the perfect way for people to dialogue anywhere on earth, that's hubris. And I don't believe I want to fall into that trap. So I just wanted to share those two things, because that's part of the problem of current social media platforms. They've built something that has had so much success, that has been used by so many people, that now in our brains, we consider this as default. And when we think social media platform, we actually think Facebook, WhatsApp, TikTok, and X. And we don't think about what else it could be. And I do believe that we need an ecology of social media platforms with the diversity that goes with it. That will bring more resilience, more diversity, more interesting interactions, and a bit more of a locally relevant ways of interacting.
Yes, I would add, and perhaps just turn off your phone. I just think that there is definitely space for limiting of engagement on social media, because from what I understand, and when I'm on it or use it myself, that it's more of a marketing tool than it is for education or for being social. It's more about providing a platform for greater consumerism, framed as a social media platform that keeps me connected or allows me to engage. I'm a huge proponent of this, that it's important for us to understand how our time and resources, our time now is creating economic wealth for Facebook or for X or for Instagram. Those commercials, even though we're not paying for them, us looking at them, we're paying for it. And so really understanding our interaction with social media as well. It's called doom scrolling for a reason. And
Right.
it's less about the interactive aspect of engagement. Everyone needs to be entertained now. It's about the entertainment of us in these spaces. And so I just think that if somehow we are able to find ways to create more social interaction that is actually in real life, you build better connections than you would on social media.
I completely agree. I'm not saying that everybody should stop talking to human beings and only talk through that platform. I really believe that if whatever amazing technology we build, if we end up to a point where humankind only interacts through screens and through technology, we're doomed. So I don't think it's a good idea. And I do believe that it's good that you can turn off your phone and that you can talk to a human being that happens to live and breathe next to you. And I completely agree with this. Then again, that's the problem with current social media platforms that needs to be addressed, not any social media platform. The moment your business model is not anymore about trying to hook people to stay more on your phone, you can build a technology on which they will only use their phone when they actually need it. And that's why we never talked about phone addiction before social media or the smartphone existed, because it wasn't a question. The child or whoever it is will only use their phone to call someone. And then there's nothing wrong with this, because at that time, it truly was a neutral technology. You could call anyone and you weren't interfered in the way you would interact with that person. So, but just wanted to share that thought that I think is important, there's something wrong with the current solution and not as much as there is with other stuff we could build. And that doesn't mean that whatever we build should be used 100% of the time. Second thing you brought in, which really thinks about regulation, right? Whatever social media platform we build, it needs to be regulated and regulated by governments and by democratically elected governments, ideally, that will put some boundaries on how private companies or private organizations can orchestrate the way we interact online. And the European Union has done some cool things. Brazil has done some cool things as well. But I think we need to go further. And France just voted a law from which children from less than 15 years old are not allowed to use social media anymore. I think that's great. I think that's one of the things we should put in place, because at that time you want to have those children actually interact with each other in real life. You don't want them to be hooked on the phone to talk to their friends or to doom scroll in both cases.
So if your platform succeeds, how do you imagine public discourse changing in 5 to 10 years?
I really don't know. I see my platform as rehabilitating something that should have built from day one. I don't intend on revolutionizing democracy. I don't intend on finding a new innovative way for us to have constructive debate that's going to bring us a better way to take decisions collectively and have our democracy act in a better way. I'm just trying to cook better food so that you stop getting sick out of eating the food you eat right now. And that doesn't mean I pretend that your health is going to be amazing. So I'm not sure. My biggest fear is not that the public discourse is less good in 5 or 10 years. My biggest fear is that we're not in a democracy anymore in 5 or 10 years. If we're still in a democracy and our public discourse is relatively preserved and we can still have discussions, I will consider that we've achieved something.
We've talked a lot about social media and platforms, but is there a role that everyday citizens play in public discourse?
I guess at the moment, our democracies are cyclical and people tend to actually give their opinion on a 4 or 5 years basis whenever there's a presidential election or midterms as far as the US is concerned. And that's the actual moment where we let people actually tell us what they think. And social media has created this illusion of we give our opinion every time we like or share something. And I'm not saying it's 100% wrong or false, but it's mostly not how it works. This is not an actual public discourse. This is not an actual debate. This is just an emotional reaction you have on something that's happening in the world. So I feel like the democratic engagement is lower than it's been for decades. And that is partially due to topics that have nothing to do with social media, right? The lack of faith in the political class and relatively sluggish economic situation as far as the Western countries are concerned, both in the US and Europe. But I also believe that there's no such thing as a golden age of democracy. And not so long ago, women were not allowed to vote. And not so long ago, there were just a very small amount of very big media companies that actually centralized all the information we got out of it. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, though.
Everyday citizens, is there a role that they play or can play in public discourse changing on social media platforms or outside of the social media platform space from your perspective?
There's a very interesting study that's been published in Le Monde, a major newspaper here in France last week, that creates a very strong correlation between places where pubs and bars have closed and the rise of extreme right voting. What's interesting behind this is that, and I don't think it's a specificity of France, by the way, is that we need third places. We need places where we can meet people and have a chat. And we're actually here for coffee or a drink, which end up being a pretext for us to actually connect in a meaningful way. So the main thing that every citizen may do, in my opinion, is not to think twice before commenting or liking a comment. I think that would be great, but the design choices of those platforms is so strong that I think it's tough to fight against this. I'd rather say focus on those places where you can have meaningful connection without any interference and making the most out of those connections. I met the person who did that study, and he finished his discourse by being asked the exact same question. And he said, well, it's very easy. Either you buy a coffee machine or you buy a draft beer system. Buy this so that people come to your place for coffee or for beer, and then you can talk. And I guess he really had a point. It's about fostering places, pretexts, occasions for you to have meaningful relationships. And most of those will never happen online, whatever cool things I might build. So I guess for the everyday citizen, I think about this first. And the second thing is vote. Freaking vote. Vote with your wallets, of course, by choosing not to buy from the companies that are openly threatening your rights and your democracies. And in that case, that also means for some of us to go out of those social media platforms, and some of us have. But obviously also means vote in the most literal way. Vote in municipal elections that happen actually in a month about in France, as well as presidential elections, as well as European elections for European citizens, whatever it is. That's what makes a democracy healthy. It's to have that voting mechanism that cannot be the only way we interact as citizens, but it still has to be a very powerful way. So those are the two things that come to mind.
Yeah, I appreciated the beer or coffee machine. In Senegal, and they say if you ever feel alone, just go to your door and make tea, because people will come and
Right?
stop and have a cup of tea with you, and then you're not
Right.
alone because they'll talk to you. So it is this thing of creating spaces where you can engage. This podcast is about democracy, and I believe that the only way that you can have democratic conversations is if you build relationships of trust with one another. And that's simply by acknowledging that you each exist as human beings and that you need that connection. And that is part of just the social fabric. Regardless of your political governance structure, we have a need to have social interaction with one another. And when we don't have that, we're left to our own devices, thinking the worst or creating spaces in which the worst of what we think can be fed and can grow. And so I want to ask you, if you had one hope for the future of democracy, what would it be?
That's a good question. Yeah, I guess there's a couple things that come to mind. There's something both cool and worrisome with the way that almost all liberal democracies in the world have an extremely similar system. They all have almost the same division of power as Montesquieu theorized it a couple centuries ago, and they all have a parliament, most of the time with two chambers, a president or a prime minister, and elections every 4 to 5 years. I do believe that there are a lot of other ways for us to have a more engaging, a more just democracy, but I don't pretend to know which one is the best. So one hopeful idea I have is that there will be more democracies in the future, but maybe not in the Western liberal traditional way, and democracies that either some smarter people than me have already thought of, or other that nobody has thought of just yet. I think that we need to reinvent our democracies also. That by itself is an amazing topic of debate for our society.
Thank you for that. It was very nice to talk to you and to learn more about the work you're doing. I really appreciate you being here with me today.
Thank you, Tina. It's been amazing for me too.
Today, we explored how the design of social media shapes not just our online interactions, but the health of our democracies. Paul reminded us that division isn't inevitable. It's built into the platforms we use every day. Reimagining these digital spaces, it isn't easy, but it is possible. By prioritizing reflection, dialogue, and accountability over outrage and speed, we can transform social media from a source of division into a space that strengthens democratic life. As you log back on, Think about the spaces you inhabit online. How could they be redesigned to foster connection, understanding, and meaningful conversation? If this episode got you thinking, take action. Engage thoughtfully, question what you see, and look for ways to foster dialogue instead of division. Share this episode with friends, colleagues, or anyone interested in the future of democracy, because the more we talk, the more we can reimagine a healthier, more deliberative online world. And don't forget to subscribe to Let's Talk Democracy so you won't miss future conversations exploring how we can strengthen democracy in the digital age. Thanks for listening, and keep the conversation going, because a healthier digital world depends on all of us. Talk with you soon.